Oh, hello, Benedicite Dominus. Welcome to question 136 of the Secunda Secundae. The topic for this lecture is patience, and I am Dr. Thibault. We're looking at the cardinal virtue of fortitude and its potential parts. So we are looking at today the part of patience, and um, we don't get its vices. All we do is get patience. Now, patience is patience a virtue? Well, that's kind of one of those things. Patience is a virtue. You probably have heard that before. So, a moral virtue, and this is a general definition. A moral virtue is directed to the good, and it safeguards the good of reason against the impulses of the passions. So that's a general uh, task of moral virtues. So patience as a moral virtue does the same. It tries to direct a person towards the good, and it safeguards them against the passions. And the passion that patience safeguards against is sorrow. So that's particularly the passion. What we get it. We'll get into that in future articles. So patience, one of the questions is, well, patience can't be a virtue because in heaven patience can't exist. What are you patient for in heaven? St. Thomas points out that patience is in heaven, but instead of enduring hardship, what one does is one enjoys the good for which one had hoped for while they were suffering. So in some ways, it's kind of one of these, the suffering becomes a jewel, right? It becomes something pleasant. If you think of altarpieces that kind of showed altarpieces that showed the suffering wounds of Christ, and then you open up the altarpiece, and inside it is the resurrected Christ, and where there were his wounds, there it's like a ruby or something like that. So the suffering becomes the thing of value. Patience then has its mirror in heaven that counteract the pain that one had endured on earth. And another objection is, well, even criminals really can use patience, right? If you think about a criminal can be very patient in undertaking the crime. Right? If a person's a bank robber, they might show patience in picking the right moment to rob the bank. Therefore, it can't be a virtue. And St. Thomas really, not to say he doesn't have a good answer for this, but it's not the best of the best of the answers. But he basically says that those who do evil are not properly using patience, since it is neither marvelous or praiseworthy. True, it's neither marvelous or praiseworthy. It does still seem like some sense of patience. But what you get fleshed out in this a bit more throughout these articles is that there is patience in a natural sense, and then there is real patience, kind of this deeper patience. And the deeper patience has more to do with the charity, which is a future uh, question. So, is patience the greatest virtue? Article 2. And St. Thomas says patience is not the greatest virtue. Funny to bring it up when you shoot it right down. But he says the greatest virtues have the greatest effect. So things like faith, hope, and love are greater virtues, which is quite obvious, right? They have to do with salvation, eternal salvation. Um, the theological virtues are bigger in some sense than, greater than the cardinal virtues. So they're not. Patience is not greater than a cardinal virtue. Um, Okay, then how about is patience better than the cardinal virtues? Um, well, prudence and justice directly establishes in man that which is good, directly establishes the good. Whereas patience is about enduring and not getting distracted. So it's not exactly, prudence and justice work directly. So that it's not as good as prudence and justice. Well, how about temperance and fortitude? St. Thomas says, a greater virtue is one that helps overcome the greatest obstacles, fear of death, right? That's fortitude itself, or the temptations of pleasure, which probably ruins more souls than the dangers of death. Those are our greater obstacles. Well, again, um, patience is dealing with sorrow, so not the danger of death, and not the pleasures of life which distract us from the holiness. So it's not as strong as that. So patience is very high, but it is not higher than the cardinal virtues or the theological virtues, according to St. Thomas. Going into the objections, I think it fleshes it out more, which is why it's important to even ask the question. Because if it's just the answer is no, I'm not even sure why you'd ask the question, because we didn't ask that to all the potential parts of cardinal virtue. We didn't always ask, is it the greatest? Sometimes we do, but not always. Uh, as St. Thomas points out, that patience perfects the works of enduring hardship. That's a beautiful line, that it perfects the enduring hardship. Right? So a person's going through a really hard time, um, struggling with cancer or financial loss, the loss of a family member or a child, these enduring hardships, patience perfects it, right? Allows one to dwell within that sorrow and not be overcome by it. Starts leading into other articles, so I'll kind of leave it at that. But uh, sorrow, sorrow is moderated by patience. Now, other things, anger is moderated by meekness, hatred is moderated by charity, and unjust injury is moderated by justice. But we're looking really here with patience at sorrow, right? Those who are sorrowing, those who are dealing with burden. It's an interesting area. Patience is the root and safeguard of all the virtues by removing the obstacle of sorrow. Um, Now, does patience depend upon grace? Some of the earlier ones started pointing in this direction. Um, so kind of like St. Thomas always does these kind of logical steps to build it up. So let me see if I can do a good job building it up. So no one suffers willingly for its own sake, but only for some end. So nobody suffers and goes, well, the season of life I'm in now is suffering, so I'm just going to sorrow in the suffering. Not really. If you're suffering, you want to get out of it, right? This isn't nobody who suffers for its own sake. If you were given the opportunity not to suffer anymore, you take the opportunity, right? You don't choose suffering for the sake of suffering. Well, that would be what we would call senseless suffering. Right? Sometimes Catholics get blamed of holding on to the cross too much, right? Holding on to suffering too much, but we don't believe in suffering for the sake of suffering. That's like poverty for the sake of poverty. We don't believe in that type of thing. Suffering or poverty for the sake of purification or redirection of the spirit, for a purpose, that's fine, which should then be moderated. But we don't believe in suffering for the sake of suffering. So clearly, St. Thomas said nobody would suffer for the sake of suffering. There has to be a reason why you would still endure that suffering. Um, and he says there's no natural reason. There's no natural reason to endure the suffering. The only reason you would be charity. If charity is the cause of ours continuing to go. So the love of life, the love of what might come after the suffering, the love of those you are suffering with. Right? How does one endure something like the Holocaust? Right? How does one endure the Holocaust? If you look to people like Frankel who survived the Holocaust, well, you have to find some type of meaning in life, right? You can't just dwell in the suffering. You have to have some sense of hope, some sense of charity, right? You find meaning by showing kindness to the person next to you. Right? You have to find sense in it. Otherwise, the suffering just will overwhelm you and consume you, right? You have to have has to have something deeper to it, which is now leading to this idea of grace, right? This idea that uh, charity is a reason to endure the suffering. This is grace, right? This is how we get that type of charity, and it leads to these deeper questions. So man prefers the good of grace to all natural goods, the loss of which causes sorrow. Right? So this is, in some sense, the essence of Soren Kierkegaard's "Suffering unto Death," where it's Kierkegaard as a Christian existentialist brings up this idea of, you know, life is filled with loss, right? There's a lot of loss in this life, earthly loss, loss of money, loss of your youth, loss of love, loss, we're filled with loss. And you just get over it, in some ways you get over it. But the only thing that you cannot get over is just that total and utter despair, right? The total despair is that kind of existential crisis. If God does not exist, then all of it is meaningless, right? There's no meaning to any of it. If God does exist, then all of it comes together, right? All of it comes together. Even when he's writing, Kierkegaard's writing to his brother who has an injury, he says, this slowing you down is giving you a chance to realize what's really important in life, which isn't all of the things we thought, right? Getting all the money and power and influence in the theater and all this. It's not really what makes you happy. You can lose all that. It doesn't really matter. There's something deeper, right? So this patience that St. Thomas is talking about isn't just putting up with it. It's not just putting up with it. It's putting up with it. It's dealing with a deep sense of uh, inner peace while overcoming sorrow. And it's not that you love the sorrow and you love the suffering, but a sense of peace in enduring it because of you see the bigger context of all of it. So it has to be grace, right? It has to be grace that provides this patience to endure. Otherwise, you just kill yourself, right? It's kind of one of these existential conclusions, right? Either the suffering has meaning, or just die. Just get the suffering over with, right? Um, and Wu and Sartre, they have their own ways of dealing with it, but the Thomistic way is, it does have meaning because God is a part of it, and with love one can overcome it. Now, is patience part of fortitude? Article 4. Um, yes, it is a potential part of fortitude. It's not the same thing as fortitude. Fortitude is persevering unto death, right? The dangers of death, not allowing the irascible appetites to get in the way of stopping somebody from pursuing um, the proper ends, right? The rational ends. Um, Patience isn't necessarily dealing with the danger of death. He says the evils inflicted are overcome by patience, which are related to the dangers of death. Right? It can be related to the dangers of death, but it's not itself the dangers of death, right? If somebody else is dying, right, a loved one is dying, they're enduring death, but you're not enduring death. In the same way, you're enduring sorrow, they're enduring death. Um, but they're related, right? You can see there's a relation there. Um, Fortitude endures dangers of death. Patience endures any kind of evil without inordinate sadness. Um, right. So if you put the whole thing in perspective, you have sadness, but not overwhelming sadness. Kind of like when Saint Augustine, when his friend, who he was even particularly close with, dies when he was a Manichaean, he was inconsolable. But after becoming a Christian, when his mother dies, uh, he was sad for the loss of his mother, but it wasn't overwhelming because of his belief in the afterlife, right? And his mother's belief in the afterlife, right? It's a different type of sadness. Uh, somebody you love dies, there's an ordinate, right, or properly ordered sadness, but it's not inordinate in terms of the light of faith and the reality of faith. Okay. Now, the last article is patience related to, is patience the same thing as longanimity? Now, longanimity is kept in its Latin on purpose. Everybody keeps it in the Latin on purpose because it is related to magnanimity, longanimity and magnanimity. So that's why they keep it there. But what longanimity means is long suffering. So long is Latin for longus, which means long. Very close translation, right? And anonymity, which we got with uh, magnanimity, is of spirit, right? A longness of spirit is longanimity, and um, its patience is similar to it, but it's not the same thing. So patience is unlike longanimity in that longanimity is an enduring for something in a long way off, right? It's a long-term endurance. Uh, so it's more like magnanimity because magnanimity is also the big picture, right? The big picture there. Longanimity as well, the big picture, long-term uh, suffering, during long-term suffering. But whereas patience is like longanimity, is that it endures evil for the sake of good, but patience is typically shorter. And the delay in the good hoped for uh, is of the nature of sorrow. So they both deal with sorrow. Longanimity deals with sorrow. Patience deals with sorrow. Patience is more short term, I guess, right? More short term, whereas longanimity is long term suffering. Somebody born with a very painful medical condition, right? That's going to be lifelong, right? That's longanimity. If you've lost a loved one, right, it's still sorrow, but it's more short term, a matter of weeks, months, years, and eventually your life starts getting back to the new normal, right? But the sorrow eventually passes a bit with patience. If it doesn't, then you're talking about longanimity. So, in conclusion, patience is a virtue. um, Coffee mugs and stuff, so it must be true. Patience is not the greatest virtue. It's not greater than theological virtues or cardinal virtues, but it's a very important virtue. Patience requires grace and charity, and I think Kierkegaard's writings on suffering unto death is a good example of that if you're familiar with it. Patience is a potential part of fortitude, right? It's if one can endure unto death with fortitude, you should be able to endure unto sorrow. But sorrow might be on the road to death. It's not really the same thing. It's not the same. It's related, but not the same. And patience is not the same as longanimity, longanimity, because patience doesn't necessarily require long-term endurance, but could be something shorter. Patience doesn't really define the time frame, whereas longanimity kind of defines that it's long-term within its definition. Okay, well, next question in 137, we will move on to perseverance.